Okay, good afternoon. Okay, just the agenda, I'm just going to go a bit of background to the Global Data Quality Initiative that we've got going on. I'm going to go through an audit that came out of some work that we're doing. We're going to talk about what kind of considerations there are for the ASC as a result of this. Debrah's then going to talk about the Global Data Quality Initiative in more detail and some of the next steps the MRS are sort of taking around this area. So, as part of the Data Quality Initiative, the MRS have been working on various work streams, and that's included looking at sources of fraud, been looking at sort of putting together definitions around market research definitions, particularly around sort of quality, and putting together some approaches to fraud from a research practitioner's perspective, particularly from an in-survey perspective. One of the areas that we looked at in sources of fraud was that we sort of saw a lot of things going on, which made us want to look at this in more detail. And there was one particular survey we picked up on, which we decided to do an audit on. So what was the background to this? This was a survey in Ireland. This one was actually high incidence. It was 70 plus incidents, so this wasn't a low incidence survey. There were 4 independent suppliers actually used on this survey. And what we noted actually was, what was noted at the time was that 50% of the completes were rejected post the survey for various reasons. Some of it through sort of looking at the open ends, and some of it based on sort of timelines and things like that. So there are already been 50% of it rejected. And what we noticed was it was coming across, when we got the sorts of the source data, we noticed it was coming across all the different sources. So we set up an audit to go into this in much more sort of detail and see what else we could sort of find about the fraud. So the first thing we did, we actually went to the suppliers of this particular survey and we asked for some details. So we basically asked for things like what were the sub-sources being used, what was the experience of that participant with that particular with that source, and how active had that participant been with that particular source. We also asked them to put together, what quality checks have they used as the participant flows through the sort of system. And one of the things we noted was just it was a very slow process to get this data through from the full supply. It was really only some of it's come through very recently. And the first thing we sort of built on was the supply chain to the 4 suppliers. So the end user buyer did not really have a clue what was going on in terms of who was being used behind the sort of scenes, as it were. So, for instance, they approached a managed network. This is someone who might have a proprietary panels or linkage into other sources. And what they went to them expecting that to be a proprietary panel. Well, they found out actually there was other sources coming in behind. They went to a sample exchange directly. Fine. They then went to an agent to get some more sample. So they went and sort of expecting them again to be supplying proprietary panel because they had panels. What actually the agent did was actually went to another sample exchange. Didn't tell the end user. And then what was found out when we got the information through was sample exchange B was actually going into sample exchange A, which was then going to the agent and then going to the end user. So it was all a bit sort of like, hang on, what was going on? And even the agent was surprised because they used sample exchange A and sample exchange B independently, but they're all sort of coming through. So it was a little bit sort of eye-opening to the sort of team looking at this. We then actually looked at some of the sampling issues or supply issues. And one of the things I noted was it really was particular sources within the supply. It wasn't really like we're seeing sort of, really diverse. It was quite sort of individual sources across the supply. But what we saw was there were some overlaps, i.e. source XYZ was coming through the managed network, was also coming through the sample exchange A, bang through to the end user. We could identify that. The same with the end user went to sample exchange B directly, had issues, therefore that's why one of the reasons when the agent and actually then the issue that they were seeing coming through sample exchange B was then coming through sample exchange A into the agent, into the end user. So it was very sort of like, hang on, what's going on? And I think the other interesting point here, going back to some of Eva's point, is that Sample Exchange B had their own checks and balances. Sample Exchange had their own checks and balances. Different ones, some using third-party solutions. Agent actually had their own checks and balances, and the end user had some sort of in-survey checks. But even doing all of that, still sort of 50% of the traffic was sort of getting through. So they were really sort of they understand how to get through the sort of sources. So what we do is a little bit sort of more in-depth detail. So first we looked at the managed network where we had source review. If we look at the numbers here, source XYZ, which are pointed out. If we looked at, we got the completes, and we got the sort of flagged issues, and we look at the number of flagged issues, and this is sort of like post a survey, we see that 94% of what was coming through that was from source XYZ. And if we look at source XYZ, 90% of what had been identified coming through that source was also described as fault. And the other 13 other sources being used, fairly comfortable. There weren't really many sort of issues on them. So it's really sort of like a one-off there. Now, the next things we looked at was experience. So when we remember experience, is how well known was the participant to that source. And what we saw there was that when we recognised it in terms of source XYZ, was 94% of the traffic was the same day the source had first seen that participant. And that compares to, say, all the others, which are good, where we see that only 10% was coming through the same day, but most of it was coming through after 30 days. So most of the sort of the good traffic was more sort of tenured, even though there was some on the same day. But what we saw was the experience was really, really high on that fraud. Also looking at the sort of the day period, this is broken down from sort of like midnight through to 11. What we sort of see is that we saw that more of the, I'll say, fraudulent attempts were happening in over the night, early morning, as well, compared to sort of what we may expect from sort of the normal expectations of our participants, which are in that sort of latter day evening. So we've had a look at the managed network. We then looked at what was coming through the agent, and what we saw there was, again, there was about 30 odd sources coming through there. 40, so 37. So 3 subsources look pretty poor. Source A, B, and C. One of them was, as we noticed, was source XYZ coming through the other source. All the others looked okay to some degree, I'd say. Again, it was filtered, on these 3 sources that were coming through quite high numbers. And the contributions from source A and source B were about sort of 90% of the starts that we were seeing. So again, if we look at the time of day that's hitting, if we look at source A, B, and C, what we can sort of see is that they're coming through overnight. Lots of the traffic is sort of overnight, early morning. Again, when you're talking to some of the third-party solutions over this, they may see, well, that's a bit odd, but it can happen. Therefore, it doesn't get scored that high. But if you get a lot of them happening, it's an issue. And again, we looked at this sort of experience. So how well known were these participants to the source? And what you can see on those which were flagged was nigh on 100% were coming on the same day. So the same day, the first experience that they had, bang, that's when they were coming in. And then if I look at the completes, this is where it started to get a little bit interesting as well. What we noted was still that from source A, B, and C, most of the completes were coming in on the same day. When we look at all the other sources, very small amount are coming in on the same day, much more sort of tenured. So, were those completes that we saw coming through on source A, B, were they sort of real? It looked a bit odd. So what I did was actually went a little bit more sort of in depth in this. So we started looking at sort of combinations of questions and things like that. And sort of noticed a little bit of pattern, sort of emerging between one particular question than the number of completes and quality failures that were going on. So I looked at one of those in more detail, and what I could sort of see was that a lot of people have been removed after the introduction of an open-end question, because the sort of end user was getting a bit worried about sort of quality levels and actually introduced an open-end question to sort of say, okay, I can start, that might actually help me identify the sort of the fraud that seems to be hitting the survey. So what in doing that, it was quite interesting. So when they added that, there was spurious answers coming in, there was sort of like some foreign brands being mentioned, and some kind of sort of patterns in the open ends which were sort of emerging. So what happened next? So we started looking at sort of these other combination of results of these ones which were happening. And what we sort of noted was that those ones which were deemed as complete in the data file were before the open end was actually added. And the end user was feeling not confident because they didn't have that open end information to actually say, yeah, actually those are actually bad or good. And it was only when we added in the subsource, we added in the experience and things like that, and it went, wow, okay, there is a whole lot of participants that should have been flagged, or hadn't been flagged. And actually ended up, when we went through, it was about 50% of the data that went to the client, actually ended up the client was actually fraud. It was sort of rubbish. So we don't know what the client did with the data, but hey, that's what you know. That's where we came to. So that's why we're saying it's important to have these additional sort of points and be able to sort of bring them in. It gives you a whole sort of kind of flavour to what is going on, particularly with understanding of how some of these sources are working. But again, as we picked up, I think is you've got to have therefore the analysis, the research and time, which I think is interesting to sort of how much can be done in real time to actually then go ahead and isolate or look at these particular, isolate these issues. So what technical impacts could this have? So I think one of the things is around data flow. And we've been sort of talking about this is how quickly, because the data was very slow to get backwards and forwards here, to actually get things more in real time, to sort of build up, is actually to create that kind of flow. So therefore, be able to bring things like source data in, bring things like experience data into the data. And of course, one of the things that we were sort of talking about is there's no point, everybody doing something different. There would have to be some kind of sort of standard that people would kind of adhere to, maybe that sort of built-in around sort of ISO or something like that. That okay, there's a structure, there's a standard that we sort of work to. I think that then the other way is come back to the suppliers, because again, information flowing back needs to be sort of quicker, so that the supplier could actually might go, oh gosh, there's something going on, and therefore may be able to sort of deal with it quicker than what was being seen in what we were experiencing. So that sort of that flow needs to be sort of quicker and with some good data. We know that quite a lot of analysis has to be done post-field, and again, it's getting that flow. How quickly can you do, and how's that sort of fed back? And one of the areas that we've sort of been discussing as a group is that not all bad-looking stuff is actually fraud. There is things that drive people to behave in such a way. Straight liners is not a bad answer. You've got to look at it in terms of how much is sort of content-driven, as opposed to something that is sort of more or less sort of deliberate. And again, how building that into the flow. Then we've got the sort of like the approaches to in-survey data checking. So what can we do sort of real time? And I think it's then bringing in those things like, which are outside the survey, things like the velocity of the data. So looking at how quickly people are sort of coming through. Time of day, how do you build that into the sort of checking process? And of course the sort of the source, because if you suddenly see something happening across a source, then it's time to sort of put a halt to things. As you noted, I think sort of open ends are pretty critical. Back in time we've said don't try and put open ends into surveys. Actually, open ends are really useful to actually identify fraud. As Eva was sort of saying, you can pick up some good, sort of great things from that. And then this approaches to post-survey data, and it's bringing all that data together and being able to analyse it and really sort of crunch the numbers, look for segments which look unusual, and be able to sort of isolate things which are unexpected. Again, whether that's through sort of AI or that's through just great regression analysis, don't know. And again, there's got to be a consideration for a lot more sort of real-time data. What can you do? How can you prove real-time to a degree that sort of works, knowing that you probably need to do something post-data at some point. So, I'll now pass over to Debrah, who will continue the call and talk more about the Global Data Quality Initiative.
I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm standing between you and lunch, and we've probably just given you a session that's given you an ulcer. So yeah, that's good for diets, is what I can say. No, I mean, clearly there's a lot going on, and the results of this audit were quite compelling and worrying in terms of some of the scale and the range of issues that are going on. And the important thing, of course, is that we've got to be doing something about it. It's all fair enough, me coming to conferences, ASC conferences, and I've been very fortunate, it's my third one in a row, talking about data quality and talking about the same issues if we're not actually creating solutions to help. So over a year ago, it was last April, we launched the Global Data Quality Initiative. So it's just over a year since we've been launched, and we have been producing output. In many ways, these are what I would call building the foundations, because there wasn't anything. There was a lot of work being done within agencies, but as associations, our job really is to get that information out there, to socialise it, and to get practitioners across all parts of the sector to understand what they can do and what they can do for themselves and what they can do to hopefully address the data quality issues that they're facing. Because not everyone has the scale of something like Ipsos and the resources available to them, but we need to be sure that practitioners across the piece are doing everything they can to address data quality. But I think the first thing, of course, is we've got to make sure that we're all talking the same language. When we launched over a year ago, I was hearing lots of people saying 40% fraud, it's 40% fraud. And then you sort of say, well, what do you mean by fraudulent records? What does that mean? What do you mean by a fraudulent participant? And actually, when you start breaking it down, that 40% was really about problems. It was about inattentive participants. It was about, bored participants. It was also about fraudulent participants. But we need to be talking the right language so that we are actually specifying the problem correctly, and so that we can address the problem correctly as well. So we've launched with the IA in the US a data quality glossary, which is available. The links up there up on the site, so that you can look at the terms we're using and see what the definitions of those terms are, to make sure that we're actually talking about the same thing. SampleCon, one of our other partners, has produced a guidance on using EndLink fraud survey research. Now, EndLinks is one way, a really good technical way of cutting out certain types of fraud. So again, this is about sort of bringing best practices to be used much more across the piece. And MRS, together with the VMO, which is the Austrian Association, we've produced a new sort of compendium, a guideline of improving data quality and integrity, some practical approaches. So some of the things that Eve was talking about earlier, we've produced this guidance which describes over 30 techniques that are currently being used across the sort of survey process. Tells you what they are, what they do, how much they cost, what kind of resources you need. Are they good for qual? Are they good for quant? Do they have an effect on things like sample integrity? What GDPR issues do you need to be aware of? We've done all of that for all of the techniques that are currently being used in survey. And the guidance is available. It is behind the member paywall. This isn't just a membership grab by MRS, because quite frankly, we don't want this guidance to be out in public circulation, because it's like a fraudster's handbook. It tells them everything they need to know. So the guidance is behind the MRS paywall, membership paywall, but it is available there for practitioners to use. And I would encourage people to look at that. Similarly, other partners such as ESMAR, they've produced guidance that's looking actually how to improve the research participant experience. So going back to that point I raised earlier, there's lots of reasons why there's problematic records. Well, one of the big reasons is participants are bored. The questionnaires are too long. they are too boring, and you've got participants who are just clicking their way through. We need to improve that experience so that actually when we've got willing and if you like, real participants, that we're treating them in a way that they're engaged and they also are willing to then take part in research again and hopefully actually encourage others to take part. Because what we need is more participants engaging in research. So, and this SMR guidance complements some of the existing guidance that SMR's produced on things like 37 questions to help buyers for online sample, which I think is quite widely used. And also, more generally, some of the broader sort of training courses and things that are out there to just about how to design better research. One of the projects also that we have done is the MRS mobile optimization research. Now, this project's been going on since 2018, so this was a precursor to all of this project, which MRS has been doing, which is about optimizing mobile research, and that is, we've got data from 2018 up until to 2023. We're just about to kick off the 2024 research, but we've also got some guidance on how to on mobile adoption and optimization of and how to optimize properly for mobile. Because again, this is about the participant experience. If you give somebody, if you design a beautiful questionnaire that works great on a desktop and then you just shove it into a mobile without doing any design changes to it, it's completely pointless and is a terrible experience. So that kind of addresses that point. So what's next up for MRS? Well, this is a huge project. I mean, we've got 8 work streams. I've got over 30 volunteers that are all working on this project, including Chris, including Simon, who's here today as well, and Shifra, who's over there as well, who's going to be presenting this afternoon. There are lots of great people who are really contributing to this project, but there is still a lot to do. First up, I think, is to get people to understand a little bit more about the sample ecosystem. The diagram that Chris showed you earlier, that was quite a simple project, and you saw the complexity of what was going on with the sample exchanges, the agent, all of these different flows. We've got to try to get that understanding of that complexity much more widely known, because our experience to date is that actually that it isn't widely known. So we're looking at visualizing that sort of sample ecosystem. We're also producing a new sample buyer's guide checklist. Now, this is different to the kind of work that SMR has done on the 37 questions. This is much more detailed technical questions that those that are buying research should be thinking about and asking to ensure that they're getting the kind of quality that they think they're getting. We're also working with SampleCon to explore the concept of a feedback loop. So going back to Chris's point, all of those problems that were identified, can we not be able to feed that back to the people where the sample's been purchased and actually get it corrected so that there's a continuous improvement, so we actually start to remove some of these problematic records and are building in measures and checks to improve it. So the feedback loop is a really important project, and SampleCon is a really important stakeholder within this, because obviously that community, we need to get their buy-in to be able to develop something effective. We're also working with AQR and QRCA, looking at what's going on in the qualitative area, because this isn't just a quant problem. It's going on in qual. In fact, in many ways, the age of the professional participant is something that came through qualitative. It's just been at scale through the quant experience. So we have done some research looking at what is going on in qual, and we're producing some new guidance to help practitioners to remove some of the issues that are also affecting qualitative. And lastly, we're documenting and classifying third-party data quality and security software. So there are lots of solutions out there. All of the solutions do different things. They don't do everything. Some do things like eye tracking, some will do things on IP addresses and so on. But it's, again, helping practitioners to understand what the solutions are that are out there and what they can do, and what kind of combination you might need to think about in order to address the kind of problems you might be experiencing. And that report will be coming out, I sort of said later this spring. I suppose officially it's actually nearly summer now, so I should say early summer. The next up for the sort of global data quality as a group is, well, first off, actually, is a project that I'm also leading, which is about, I'm trying to get, in the UK at least, research fraud classified as a crime. So I'm working with the Home Office and the police to get research fraud classified as a crime so that we can actually start logging it and recording it and getting the instances of it reported to the police. Now, I'm not going to say that police are going to sort of suddenly, get off their backsides and suddenly start investigating research fraud because it's the most important thing. But if we actually get it recognised as a criminal activity and it's starting to be logged as a criminal activity, then it becomes an issue where the police and the Home Office start taking it much more seriously in terms of the things that they need to do. More importantly, as practitioners, when you're doing things like signing people up to panels, asking people to take part in research, you can actually also put in statements along the lines of research fraud won't be tolerated, we report all of these crimes to the police, to discourage some of those individuals that may be watching some of the YouTube videos that's telling them how to be able to sort of, get around all these data quality requirements. So you can earn a bit more money and it's a bit of a side hustle and all that sort of thing. Actually, to contextualise that much more with it, sort of people to say, actually, this isn't a side hustle, it's actually a crime, so don't do it. So we're sort of trialling this in the UK. I've got inroads into the police and the Home Office to do this. And there's also something called the Online Fraud Charter, which is a voluntary thing that a lot of the social media companies have signed up to, which we're kind of using as a vehicle for this. But if it works, the other associations that are involved in GDQ are also thinking about potentially trying to do something in their countries as well. We've got the next round of the mobile optimization, as I said. CRIC, this has actually now been launched. They've also launched a new buyer's guide for data quality, which is kind of something, again, just trying to get the buyers and the clients into the conversation, not getting them so that they don't want to buy research anymore, because that would be obviously kind of, might as well go home. But getting them into the conversation so that they understand some of the issues that are going on, so that there are at least sort of the quality buying signals are being used. The Insights Association is developing some new quantitative benchmarks to measure and track data fraud, because we need to know what are the percentages, what are the numbers we're dealing with? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Are the things that we're doing making any difference at all? And finally, our colleagues in Australia, the Research Society, they're developing new guidelines on incentives. And Frank Kelly, who's also here, he's involved with that as well. And that's really important because, again, one of the points that Eve raised is that incentives can encourage fraud, particularly in the business-to-business sphere. What we need from you, we need you to engage. All this stuff is being created by the associations, but we need to know, is it working? Are there things missing? Are there things that you're doing that we haven't covered? Because we need to keep things current and we need to keep them comprehensive. Just use the best practices that are available. And if there's any questions, I'll be delighted to take them, as will Chris as well. Hello, nice to see you.
That was brilliant, thank you. Yes, so I think one of the biggest barriers that was mentioned was real-time data flow and getting that data in for analysis and feeding back to other providers, sample providers, etc. And also that the data quality applications can't access data either, so say they might build a real-time connection to Decipher. That's not going to be relevant when they go to Alchema, and that's not going to be relevant when they go to Forster, and so we've got this weird kind of barriers, walls everywhere.
Yes.
So I wonder whether I might introduce TSAPI
I need this.
and volunteer our services to help you to help support the initiatives of data quality.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that I've been looking at TSAPI. Yeah, I think it's part of the solution because we need to get some commonality. So that we can, because that is part of the problem. The ecosystem is so complicated that a lot of the time, but it's also, so people go, I don't know how we can address this. So we need to kind of look at things that can do it. So that is a very good point.
Yeah, accurate service.
Frank?
A couple of observations. One, it seems as though we've seen a real shift from panel to more interactive, dynamic sources, to bring in all debate. At the same time, we've seen quality problems increase. And, obviously with panels, you can look at performance over time, and with dynamically sourced respondents, you don't have as much to work with, because of the issues you mentioned. So I guess the question is this back to the old problem we had 10 years ago of dynamic sources versus panel sources? And one, the solution might be to help encourage panels again?
Absolutely. One of the things we're talking in the sample ecosystem is actually what checking is done like new sources. What we have sort of learned a little bit is that actually it's not people coming in to get the incentives, which is the actual issue. It's actually companies actually building to try and get this actual CPI. So the cost per interview. So they're actually registering as a company, having a load of people there. They're not there working in the centre, they're working on the CPI. So the cost they get actually from, let's say, a sample exchange, etc., then it's sort of dished out. So it's a different model away from the actual trying to get the incentive, which is quite interesting. And I think what we've been looking at is sort of like, what are the checks and balances to actually bring a new source into play? And it looks, and again, when we went through, it's quite limited today. And I think, again, because people want to get, they've got that person, they want to get money off them, because it's a sort of like a money exchange, they want to get that money as quickly as possible. Therefore, they don't want to necessarily delay it and go, hang on, can I check this person a little bit sort of longer? So I think observations could be that there needs to be more done from, let's say, standards, etc., on how to look at newer sources coming in. As you said, most of these things are new people coming in. You know, once you know them, you sort of you're in a better place. You've got more sort of knowledge, etc., etc. And the same with panels; they've got a lot more sort of knowledge.
I wondered if, from a research point of view, Steve, whether you managed to, when you isolated your 50% plus of bad quality, bad actors, whatever you want to call that group, did you actually then look at the research questions and see any differences in responses as an aggregated data?
No, that's sorry. Actually, didn't quite do that, to be honest. We were just looking in that. There's some other research where we have been looking at doing that kind of stuff, but not on this research itself.
Yeah. I mean, the point of the question is because it actually is kind of goes beyond. It could be bad quality, as in fraudulent, but it can now be in some ways good enough, particularly with the open questions that we looked at earlier, that actually that can mimic real life stuff and actually look plausible data.
Well, that's the
But
point. I
actually
think,
bad actors,
yeah.
So that makes it even harder to find.
Exactly, and I think that's why, looking at the open ends, I think as we pointed out earlier, it's really sort of quite trying to understand what is human, what is not, and what's not real. It's getting more difficult. But I think the key thing is bringing this other information in actually then helps when you actually look at the sort of survey data itself, having more knowledge, and I think that's what we're aiming at.
Any other questions?
Hi.
Mina?
Just curious about the point at the end when you were talking about the criminalisation of this activity. Where are we at the moment with discussions with the Home Office as to how this can be reported and therefore penalised?
Yeah, well, anyone who's ever dealt with the police and the Home Office will know my pain. Okay, so it's been, I had conversations with the Home Office first, who said, no, you've got to go to the police and get it classified as a crime. And then when I spoke to the police went, yeah, we think it is a crime, but you need to go back to the Home Office now and get them to give you a code to tell you that it's, and so that they can log it. So it's a complicated conversation, but there's something called action fraud. I don't know whether you've ever come across this site. So if you've ever unfortunately been a victim of fraud, you can go to the action fraud site as a citizen of the UK and log your experience of it, what's happened, how much, all those kinds of things. What we are working to do is to have research fraud as one of the loggable things that you can include on action fraud. So it's a national website. You'll be able to put the details in. It will all get logged, but if we can get it all coded to the same thing, which is research fraud, that means that then we can really start to classify and put a number to how much fraud is really going on. And so the next steps for me is I've got to have detailed conversations with the Home Office, creating some case studies of the type of fraud we're experiencing to get us recognised. Once that happens, and I'm convinced it's going to happen, I'm on the case, then the next step will be that the action fraud site will change its site to include research fraud, and then we'll be able to log that information onto the site. And the police have agreed that they will do things like a joint webinar with us to actually tell practitioners how to use the site and how to log it, so that we can really start getting that evidence base. But I do think if we want to be taken seriously, we've also got to get it recognised that this is happening.
No, I mean beyond logging it.
Yeah.
Obviously, the logging helps to establish the extent of the problem. But is there any penalty attached?
Well, yeah, no, that's a good.
What are the police going to actually do to criminalise? I mean, not to criminalise, to punish.
Investigate and so on. Yeah, I think the way that the police work is kind of like a triage approach. They will concentrate on things that have high risk, high impact. But the only way that they can identify things if they've got high risk, high impact is if it's recorded in the first place. They are not going to go after every single sort of, Fred in his shed who's decided to sort of pretend he's got a Mercedes when really he's got a bike. They're not going to be doing that. But what they are interested in is they will be looking for patterns and potential organisations which might be committing large-scale fraud that could also be funding crime in other ways in terms of and using it for other purposes. So they will look at those high-risk things, but I think that is still okay, because what we're trying to also do is discourage. We're trying to discourage people from creating things like YouTube sites that tell people how to, sort of manipulate URLs or whatever else it might be. And so it's also discouraging that kind of content, but also if we get it recognised, the Online Fraud Charter, all of the social media sites that have signed up to that, which includes TikTok, includes Meta, includes Microsoft, Instagram and so on, they have an obligation to take down content that's found to be encouraging fraud. So we can also get those sites taken down, because we need to remove the knowledge from the marketplace as well. So this is not an easy win. I've already been working on it about 6 months, and so far it's kind of I've gone from the Home Office to the police and back to the Home Office, so that's not great. But equally, I now can see quite a clear pathway about how to achieve it. So, and from an MRS perspective, we are going to continue on this until we get it done. Hi, Simon.
I think that's great, and kind of working in that direction is one thing. I mean, I would also make the point that we don't want it as an industry be in a situation where we kind of blame them for trying to get into stuff. It's a little bit like if you get burgled but you left your front door open. I think it's a two-way thing.
Oh, no, definitely. This is just part of the jigsaw. And I think that's the thing about the GDQ. It is a big jigsaw puzzle of different things addressing different parts of the problem. But no, there is a lot that as a sector that we have got to do. We are slightly under attack. And the investment that's being made by suppliers is phenomenal. The amount of time and resources and expertise that's being deployed is amazing. And in effect, what we as associations have to do is kind of support that, but do things that we can do. These kind of discussions with the police, that's the sort of thing an association could do. The sorts of things that Eve was talking about in terms of the technology that's being brought in and the processes and the expertise that's being deployed, that's what agencies can do. And it's getting all these jigsaw pieces together so that we come up with a much more robust system. We're never going to get rid of fraud. That's impossible. But if we can contain it and certainly make it better than it currently is, then that's the direction we need to be going in.
Okay, thank you everybody. That was a really great session, great questions.
Lunch.